The Russian tried to treat his friend's wounds, but soon he would make a desperate decision for both of them. The assault groups from Alkania acted to try to prevent their enemies from continuing to advance in Zaporizhzhia. The soldiers hunted with their rifles while the drone pilots flew over fighters under Moscow's command in that desperate struggle to eliminate as many of them as possible. The front was heating up with a new strategy from Kiev and new orders from Moscow on that axis. The story there also involved the journey of two brothers who went to the front to prove their worth to their own homeland. The Zaporizhzhia front was boiling after years of stalemate. The main intelligence directorate of Alkania, the BUR, took part in this process, launching special groups in precise and dangerous raids against villages controlled by Russian forces. The rifles aimed inside the houses fired without asking, as the Russians were ready to ambush the Ukrainian forces. The assaults were difficult. Many Ukrainian soldiers were lost even during the movement toward the attack, hit by drones or artillery. Survivors crossed a wall of Russian fire to deliver hot ammunition into enemy flesh. They acted quickly, always in groups, to cover each other during the assaults. In some cases, the Russians preferred to surrender before their missions were permanently ended by Ukrainian ammunition. The prisoners were sent to the rear, while the Gulf forces continued with the wealthy setting off gunpowder in the villages of Zaporizhzhia. In some cases, Russians sent to the rear continued with the wealthy setting off gunpowder in the villages of Zaporizhzhia. In some cases, the Russians sent gunpowder from the wealthy villages of Zaporizhzhia. In some cases, Russians were sent to the wealthy villages of Zaporizhzhia. Sent to the rear, the wealthy Russians continued setting off gunpowder in the villages of Zaporizhzhia. Sent to the rear, the wealthy were setting off gunpowder in Zaporizhzhia. In some cases, Russians, after the Ukrainian counteroffensive of 2023, which culminated in the temporary capture of the ruins of Robotyne. At an extremely high material cost, the southern front stabilized in a configuration that favored deep defense. Afterwards, the tactical axis included the localities of Orikhiv, Robotyne, Verbov, and Mala Tokmachka. Besides Stryapivka, further to the west, it became one of the most contested sectors of the war of attrition between the beginning of 2025 and the first half of 2026. The Russian Gleb Mikhailovich Yarovoy volunteered for that sector, finding himself caught between orders from Moscow and Kiev that would increase the risks for all soldiers in the region. He had many reasons to be there. One of them came from the period immediately before he volunteered. Another was his brother Nikolai Mikhailovich Yarovoy, the oldest of Tatiana Yarovoy's 4 sons. He was the first to see combat in Ukraine becoming the pride of Gleb and their mother. Nikolai went to Ukraine at the very beginning of the invasion as part of the 136th Motorized Brigade based in Boynax, Dagestan, under the 58th Corps of the Russian Army. But he already had some military experience. Nikolai studied at the Ryazan Cossack Cadet Corps between 2014 and 2016 and signed a formal military contract in 2016. In September 2019, he has been serving in the 30th and 36th Brigades since then. Russian sources record that the brigade took part in the invasion of Ukraine attacking from Crimea. Nikolai went along with the troops, although at that time, some of his comrades had made a different decision. About 300 soldiers from the unit reportedly refused to continue fighting, returned to Russia, and submitted requests to leave the service. The Russian columns left Crimea and advanced quickly to Melitopol, which fell on February 25, 2022. Next, the Russians took Primorsk and Berdyansk, opening the land corridor along the Sea of Azov. Nikolai was a shooter operator of the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion. He was far ahead of the brigade, following the fighting that was putting pressure on the Ukrainians. He was only 22 years old at the time. He left his siblings still in school when he left for the invasion of Ukraine. Gleb couldn't even enlist yet, but there was something else that would keep that young man's mind focused on the war. Meanwhile, Nikolai sent news from the conflict, which up until that moment had been extremely favorable for Russia. On the northernmost front, the Russians advanced to Vasilivka, Dnipro, Rudnik, Tupak, Polohi, Uliapol, and Enerhodar. Defended by elements of the 128th Ukrainian Mountain Assault Brigade until their withdrawal on March 2nd. After that, the Ukrainians retreated to Mali Sherbak and Esherbak, where the Russians heavily bombarded but were unable to take the villages at that time. The Ukrainian response began to emerge afterwards, frustrating the Russian intention to continue advancing toward the capital of the oblast. The Ukrainian response by the team would become a deadly frontier on that axis of the war. It was in April 2022 that Tatiana and Gleb received the Medal of Courage from Nikolai. The mother was proud, and so was the brother. The medal was given to them to replace a son who would never return home. This affected the whole family, but it did not diminish any of their faith in what they called the special operation in Ukraine. Gleb had Russia in his heart. Before the war, he didn't dream of a military career, but of the stage. However, his brother's death made the wartime propaganda take deeper hold in his heart. Gleb was still part of the Skopinski Youth Theater, which his brother had also participated in, but he stopped everything for another purpose. The family was still living in Ryazan when Tatiana Yarovoy saw her son leave at 17 years old for the Avant-Garde Patriotic Military Center. It was a 5-day basic military training course for young people, but it was enough to capture the young man's heart. It was all part of a government program aimed at instilling military concepts in that age group. In 2025, at the age of 20, deeply affected by his brother's death and by the camp, Gleb was already in Ukraine. The Russians destroyed villages and towns along the Zaporizhzhia combat axis. The planes dropped dozens of FAB bombs to clear the way for Moscow's new intentions. The 58th Russian Army Corps was supposed to put pressure on the Ukrainian stronghold of Orikhiv from two secondary directions, from the west, advancing from the Dnieper River, and from the south, attacking directly from the Robotyne-Kerbal line. During the fall and early winter of 2025, Gleb was among the Russian units that systematically took advantage of adverse weather conditions such as rain, fog, and snow to camouflage their movements and neutralize the reconnaissance and attack capabilities of Ukrainian drones. This methodological adaptation allowed Russia to accelerate its pace of territorial advance throughout 2025, capturing a total of 4,831 square kilometers in Ukraine. Gleb arrived in the war zone in October 2025 and saw that the avant-garde training was very different from what was happening in Ukraine. The Ukrainian defensive lines suffered from such intense attacks. The Russian forces saw many drones flying over the area to find the positions where Kyiv's soldiers had been placed. They also knew that Kyiv didn't have that many men to fill the entire space. The Ukrainian population was much smaller than the Russian one. In certain areas, up to 12 soldiers were spread out along a stretch of 5 to 10 kilometers, a density much lower than that foreseen by NATO's plans during the Cold War in high-intensity defense scenarios. The Russians wanted to take advantage of this, sending men along the entire line and passing through the unoccupied gaps. But the Ukrainians learned to make up for this weakness with drones. It didn't replace manpower, but it helped. The threat in the sky dropped an explosive on 2 men. The blast was so strong that there wasn't even time for them to agonize. Death was instantaneous. When the Russians occupied many of the empty Ukrainian positions, assault groups were sent to eliminate the threat before more soldiers could arrive at that position. The grenades arced to fall into the holes. The rifles were aimed into the defensive position as the squad began to move. The command of the 222nd Brigade used drones to guide the soldiers. Rifles fired at the only opening where the Russians were still hiding. They had no way out with so many weapons aimed at them and after so many grenades. The Ukrainians entered the trench and finished the assault. Then they left the area waiting for the next mission. There weren't enough people to occupy that trench, but drone surveillance would try to take out any Russians who showed up there. And more Russians would be sent. The drones found a pair under a tree. Unfortunately for them, that was a time when the Babi-Yar were in the sky, armed with various explosives. Trying to use their rifles didn't help. The drone was too high, ready to let the detonations do their work on the ground. They were heavy explosives that threw the men to the ground. One of them was wounded to the point of being unable to move. His comrade risked helping him with a tourniquet to keep him from bleeding to death. But Babi, the demon from the sky, was there to drop more explosives. The new explosion killed the hope of survival for the man who was still standing. He grabbed the rifle and quickly decided his friend's fate. Then, he turned the barrel of the rifle toward himself. Gleb was in those assault groups. That was the fate of many Russians sent to war. He waited for the multiple rocket launchers to bombard the Ukrainians so he could finally move. He had to keep going through the cold winds that cut across the fields. The drones also identified where the Ukrainians were placing their troops. The kamikaze drones tried to do the dirty work before Gleb arrived, and that wasn't all. The artillery was relentless that winter. After the arrival of the heavy ammunition, more drones were launched to try to take out the Ukrainians hiding in the holes or covered by the snow. Watching so much activity and the power of the Russians made Gleb confident, but something else was happening that he didn't see. Something that in fact not even some Russian commanders noticed. Besides the tactical front, Ukraine intensified its medium and long-range logistical interdiction campaign in 2025 and 2026, with the deliberate goal of imposing a logistical blockade on Russian forces in the south. The strategy relied on the use of domestically produced FP-5 Flamingo cruise missiles and long-range FP-1 drones. One of these hit a Russian drone warehouse in the direction of Zaporizhzhia, taking away a very important resource from the war. The Ukrainian campaign against the Russian rear continued at several points along the front. Drones from the Special Operations Forces hit missile and artillery ammunition depots more than 100 kilometers from the line of contact, showing that the pressure on Russian logistics continued to advance beyond the combat positions. In the Zaporizhzhia region, 2 Russian locomotives were destroyed by fixed-wing FPV kamikaze drones in the village of Malabeloz. Also in Zaporizhzhia, Ukrainian FP-2 hit a Russian logistics center and destroyed fuel tanker trucks in the Ozipin area. The attacks also reached the air defense system. The AVZFP-2, along with an as-yet unidentified drone, hit the 5050 ME-2 radar of the S-350 system and the Russian Torno Tor M2KM, with actions recorded southeast of Novo-Alexandrovka. In the Donetsk region and in the Milipotol area in Zaporizhzhia, the pattern was clear. Ukraine continued to use long-range drones to degrade depots, rail transport, fuel, and air defense, weakening Russia's ability to sustain operations on the front line. This happened throughout 2025 and 2026, wearing down Russian logistics more and more. Meanwhile, on the ground, the fighting continued right on the front line. Klebs had been in combat for 2 months, watching the situation get more and more tense. The war was changing once again. The Ukrainian soldiers were still being hunted by the Russians. Assault groups or men on defense were chased in the field. The bodies of many of them were left exposed in the gray zone that was forming. Russian drone pilots were highly active in Zaporizhzhia. They had lost a lot of strength after the fall of but they were still taking Ukrainian lives. Fatuman had Kiev worried, as he needed to maintain the defense while putting pressure on the Russians. But the Ukrainian special forces avoided many of these drones to hunt the Russians in Zaporizhzhia. The men climbed onto the destroyed buildings to use grenade launchers against enemy positions. They ran between the houses, sneaking into abandoned homes, still with belongings of Ukrainians who had just left the place. The machine guns rattled, firing rounds to create more Russian corpses. Grenades rolled into the holes. There were many explosions, including more explosives flying from the buildings to blow up the Russian bodies. One of the men from Moscow tried to escape, sneaking through the village, but the drones made sure to alert the assault group. The Ukrainian moved quickly, aiming in the direction of the Russian. The round covered the distance in seconds, making the enemy soldier collapse dead. The Ukrainian Air Force also hunted the Russians. Gleb saw the buildings exploding, but that wasn't even the greatest terror. The worst were the drones. There was a demonic swarm of them in the sky. They were always hunting. The explosions from those pests were frequent. The sound of the propellers was the greatest terror for the modern soldier. There wasn't much to do. Every attempt by a soldier to hide seemed fruitless. Death had eyes that were too watchful. It was swift, with its hands coming down to grab Russian souls. Thus, the friction in the region increased. Soon there were terrified men surrounded by corpses just waiting for their time to leave. In the midst of that terror, Gleb was among the corpses. He became one of them in December 2025 at the age of 20, about 2 months after arriving in Ukraine. The mother would receive a medal on behalf of her son, knowing that there would still be more of them to go to the avant-garde equipment. She would receive news that the Russians had advanced in the Uliai Polo region, but lost little territory near Stepnohist and Malakotmak until June 2026. She would also receive a call to let her know that her son had been invited to another theater performance, but she hung up the phone with no one to share the news with. She took a deep breath, thinking of Gleb and Nikolai, now having only one more daughter and boy to embrace. Perhaps if the war lasted longer, she would be left with only 3 medals and her daughter to keep her company. All in the name of the motherland.